All right. Well, I will begin, as always, by thanking Marcus Smith and the team at Thinking Aloud for allowing us to interview another distinguished guest to BYU. Our guest today is Ann Rigney, who holds the chair of comparative literature at the University of Utrecht in Holland. Since 2005, she's also been a Royal Fellow at the Royal Dutch Academy of Sciences. She's an expert in the work of cultural memory. She published a really landmark book 2 years ago called The Afterlives of Walter Scott, subtitled Memory on the Move, and is involved right now in a European network for the study of cultural memory. Anne, welcome to BYU. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, thank you. It's really a pleasure. We're going to get to cultural memory in a moment. Very briefly, I think our audience hears Utrecht. They think, oh, she's Dutch, but you aren't. Where are you from?
You probably hear it from my accent pretty quickly. I'm from Ireland, though I haven't lived in Ireland for the last 30 years. But I've always been, I guess, directed, interested in the world outside, other languages. That's why I ended up in comparative literature. Yeah. Went to Canada and then ended up with a job in comparative literature in Utrecht. So I'm a woman of the world.
Right. Now I've heard your work in many parts of the world now. Actually, yeah. I've heard you lecture in many parts of the world, Scotland in the U.S., in many states in the U.S. Actually. Now you are a specialist in the field of cultural memory. For those unfamiliar with what cultural memory is, can you explain briefly what that field is, what it means?
Well, I guess everybody knows what memory is because everybody has a personal memory which works well or not, depending on your age. But we also have societies also can remember things, but they do so not through brains, but through monuments and stories and buildings. And so I'm interested in how societies remember, and that's what we call cultural memory.
Okay, very good. Is this a long-standing interest of yours, or is it fairly recent? How far back does your work in cultural memory go?
Well, I guess it goes right back to Ireland in a sense, growing up in a country where the past and how we tell stories about the past, how we commemorate the past, has been so incredibly important but also very divisive. I think that ever since then I've been interested in how different societies have dealt differently with their past. So it goes back the whole way.
Oh, that's really interesting, the Irish connection. The book you wrote, we're going to get to the book you wrote in a minute on Walter Scott, which is he's not known as a great Irish author, a Scottish author, although a very international author. One thing I'm curious about is why you think work on cultural memory that you've done has struck such a chord. I mean, a lot of scholars produce excellent work, and I call your work excellent work. But it's one thing to do excellent work and something else to do excellent work that really strikes a chord. What about cultural memory these days do you think makes it so resonant with how people are thinking?
Well, some people have said we're living in a memory boom, that the intensity with which we're putting up monuments, and this campus is an extraordinary example of the way in which cultural memory is working. I think it's part of our time that we're concerned with how we deal with the past, possibly because also we're moving into the future so quickly. And so ever since the Second World War, you can talk about a memory boom. And I think that's one of the reasons why cultural memory studies has developed as a field, but also why it's getting this resonance among the public.
Yeah, okay, that's an interesting sort of way to situate it, sort of post-World War II. One of the phrases associated with cultural memory, at least that I know, it's kind of widely known, is a phrase that the French intellectual Pierre Nora, or Nora to give it its French pronunciation, called the lieu de mémoire, translated either as sites of memory or realms of memory. Can you explain to our audience what a site or realm of memory means? And do you see your work developing out of Nora's or departing from it in important ways?
Okay. Well, the sites of memory, as he's presenting it, is linked to this idea of modernization, that people were no longer living in the places where they were born, in contrast to more traditional societies where there was a continuity between past and present. I'm simplifying greatly, but that's the basic idea. So once people start moving around, they start having to then recreate memories in a more self-conscious way by looking for markers which connect us to the past and which carry stories with us. And the United States is fascinating for that reason, the way in which names have been transported, even New York, a new version of the old York. And you see this sort of process going on the whole time, and certainly in the modern period, of recreating and self-consciously establishing a continuity.
So does your work then, I mean, has Nora been important to you as a scholar, or is he somebody who's just sort of helps to sort of create some basic landmarks for the field itself? I guess is he of direct importance to you or not so much? Or do you feel you're doing something different in the area of cultural memory than Nora was doing?
Well, I like to think I'm doing something different, otherwise I'll be repeating something done 30 years ago. So I see myself very much in the tradition of Nora, but trying to go beyond him, because I think he's a very static notion of societies of memory. It's done once and for all, and it's uncontested. And what I'm interested in is the way in which even the memory culture changes, in which we add things into we add new stories into the mix. And sometimes those sites also become sites of contestation. We disagree about memory, and those sites then become sites of discussion and debate. And Nora isn't interested in that. Okay,
good. Okay. That's a good segue from me into your book on Walter Scott, because it takes up a specific case with a very wide reach or really set of instances of commemoration. And one of my questions for you is, what came first, your interest in Walter Scott, which then fueled an interest in cultural memory, or the interest in cultural memory which found a locus in Walter Scott? It's chicken and egg, I guess. Yeah, but I think it's the second one. I was interested in cultural memory, as I said, the whole way back. I'd written on the French Revolution. But Walter Scott kept on turning up as the inventor of the historical novel. And in a sense, the popularity of this memory culture I saw as emanating from his work in storytelling through the historical novel. So I felt I couldn't ignore him. He was the elephant in every room I went into. Yeah. So I decided to try and grasp his trunk or his tail, whatever, and study him in more depth. Yeah. Okay. The elephant in every room, that's an interesting way to put it. Because Scott, was known to his readers for a long time as the great unknown, because he wouldn't put his name on these famous historical novels until later in his career. But you say that the great unknown became the great forgotten. So the elephant that was forgotten. Can you explain why you call Scott the great forgotten, and what form that forgetting perhaps took in the area of memory studies? Yeah. Well, if you go back into the 19th century, in the period when Scott was active, he was everywhere with his Lady of the Lake, with Ivanhoe, with Rob Roy, and all of those terms that we're now familiar with and which have penetrated right into American culture, even into, Hail to the Chief, coming indirectly from the Lady of the Lake. So 19th century, Scott is everywhere. But now with my students, and I suspect with many students here, if you ask them, what have you read of Walter Scott, they will sort of maybe look a bit dazed and say, yeah, I did read Ivanhoe once, or my mother did. And so that was indicative of the fact that somebody who was so important somehow is no longer important. So that made me think that this memory culture is also about a culture of forgetting. And so I became interested in tracing the rise and fall of the presence of this elephant in our cultural room. What is the relationship between memory and forgetting, as you understand? Is that great moment, and is it Ulysses? I think James Joyce's Ulysses, departing from Scott for a moment, where Stephen Dedalus says, history is a nightmare which I'm trying to awake, as though he can't forget the history. And yet forgetting is a very important part of memory, right, in your work. How is that the case, and specifically, how is it the case in the memory of Walter Scott? A really important and difficult question. I think once we realise that memory is always selective, it's about highlighting certain stories, there's always an implicit sort of forgetting that's going on there. But also somebody like Scott was himself dealing with a very troubled history in Scotland. Only he's writing 60 years after the Battle of Culloden, the defeat of
of Scotland. So there's a very painful history there. And what would you see Scott trying to do is how can we remember, but in a way that we remember the good bits and forget the pain and the difficulties of the past. And I think that's still going on. I mean, a lot of the interest in memory is about a sense of how do we deal with these troubled pasts, particularly coming out of the Second World War. Okay, good.
I'm going to pick up on that in a moment because it's a really interesting thing you just said, I think, really important point. Scott, so what are some examples of ways that Scott has been remembered, commemorated? Clearly he's been an influence on other writers, but beyond that, what are ways he's been remembered more broadly culturally?
Well, the fascinating thing about Scott is that he's an incredibly important writer, but his influence, you see, and his inspiration has also been in other fields of culture. So, I think the most obvious example is in the sort of neo-Gothic, neo-medieval architecture, which provides the model for many suburbs in North America and Britain in the late 19th century. I see that this is an indirect offshoot of the interest, among other things, in the Middle Ages, which Scott provoked and stimulated through his Ivanhoe, which was such an extraordinary, influential text. So it's a very broad sort of influence, but we see it in material culture, in everyday culture, in this sort of interest, particularly in the medieval.
Sure. Now, Scott is obviously widely remembered in Edinburgh. I mean, when you pull into Edinburgh on the train, you pull into Waverley Station, Waverley being the title of Scott's first novel. And you get out of Waverley Station, and right there across the park is this huge, very striking Gothic structure, the Scott Monument. Clearly, he's remembered in Scotland. Are there parts of the world, though, where he's been also especially vividly remembered?
Well, I think the United States is one place. If you go into Central Park, what do you find? You find a statue of Columbus, of Shakespeare, and of Walter Scott. And I've always been fascinated by this idea of sort of relocating Scott in the heart of Manhattan. And there are other places in Australia, Canada, in basically what we call the English-speaking world. I think we find traces of Scott everywhere, also in the names. And you've not only Waverley Station in Edinburgh, you've Waverley towns scattered across the English-speaking world. So here we see him again in the actual material environment.
Yeah, all right. There's a famous line by Mark Twain, and I forget the exact. I'll paraphrase it. But, Walter Scott is to blame for the cause of the American Civil War.
He caused the Civil War.
He caused the Civil War. Walter Scott, who knew, right?
Yeah.
So, what did Twain? He can't have meant that literally, but what did he mean by it, and why did he invoke Walter Scott?
Yeah. I think he was, in a certain way, jealous of Walter Scott's success and wanted to replace him. I think that's part of it. But I think he did have a point to make, and that was about looking at the popularity, particularly of Ivanhoe in the southern United States. Scott was read everywhere throughout the United States, but Ivanhoe was particularly important in the southern states and became a sort of an identity marker also through the tournaments, the medieval tournaments, which were reenactments of Ivanhoe. I talk about this a lot in my book. And because of this sort of notion of the chivalric knight and the notion of a certain conservatism crept into the self-identity of the southern states, that Scott linked this to, say that Scott caused the Civil War. Clearly he didn't cause the war, but I think he became a way in which a symbol of southern culture, which was embraced also by people in the South after the war, when we see continuing cult of Scott.
Okay, sure. Wasn't it one of your lectures? I want to say it was a lecture of yours I heard at the Walter Scott Conference in Wyoming 3 years ago, where you talked about the name of a steamboat in the set, wasn't it? The Sir Walter Scott was the name of the steamboat. So, which is an example of what you're talking about, right, with the ways that Scott was commemorated. And there are lots of these ways. You mentioned these medieval reenactments of Idaho. You have novelistic memories of Scott, but there are also festivals, theatrical productions, place names. Are there a couple of these instances of commemoration that you find yourself most interesting or bizarre? Do you have a couple that are your favorites?
I'm not sure it's necessarily my favorite, but I'm very struck by, indeed, in this performance of different versions of Scott, that to look at a poem like The Lady of the Lake, which on the one hand can turn into sort of Hail to the Chief in an 1812, derived from an 1812 adaptation of Scott's poem.
Yeah, and what's that connection? Explain for our audience, Lady of the Lake and Hail to the Chief?
Well, it's one of the songs which is in the poem, the Lady of the Lake, and it was, like many of Scott's works, put on the stage. We had an 1812 version in, I think, Washington or New York, which was then appealed to the US presidents and has since then become one of the markers of the US presidency. I think most people will not know the connection with Walter Scott. Right. On the other hand, something like the Fiery Cross in the Ku Klux Klan, which I think is one of the less one of the darker sides of the reception of Walter Scott, but I think there is a clear paper trail back from the use of that symbol of the Fiery Cross again to the Lady of the Lake. So one of the interesting things about this sort of study is that you can't predict in advance where a work will end up. And tracing Scott, you find him used as a sort of liberationist figure in Europe, and at the same time used as a symbol of a sort of a devotion to a certain tradition. Okay. Which is not emancipatory, but very conservative. Not.
Right, that's a very striking juxtaposition. Hail to the Chief on the one end and the Fiery Cross on the other end. That's really, it captures quite a gamut, doesn't it, of ways of commemorating Scott. You mentioned a couple times in our discussion Ivanhoe, perhaps Scott's best-known novel, and you've mentioned also Lady of the Lake. Were these perhaps the two works most often remembered about Scott, or is there a third or a fourth in there that seems to have been left a special mark on history?
I think that's a fascinating question to see which ones are remembered and which ones are forgotten, because of all the huge 26 novels corpus that Scott produced, basically, nowadays Ivanhoe is the one which has survived. But there are other ones like Rob Roy, which I think has been revived in many ways through recent, films of movies of Rob Roy, which has given it a new lease of life. I think ultimately the most important one was perhaps Waverley, his first novel, which has given rise to so many street names and place names. But interestingly enough, doesn't have an afterlife in movies. We're still waiting for the Hollywood version of
true.
Waverley. Yeah.
What's wrong with Hollywood anyway, right? I mean, it's okay.
Well, Scott was the Hollywood of 19th century.
This is true, actually. Absolutely. I mean, blockbuster novels, right? I mean, written at a huge scale in terms of audience reception, and very international. So let me ask you about Scott's relationship with his very famous countryman, Robert Burns. Scholars have pointed out, you can find this in Burns's letters, that Burns very self-consciously fashioned himself as the Scotch Bard. He wanted to be remembered as the great poet of Scotland. It wasn't just that he spoke these organic verses, right, that were naturally expressive of the country. He really wanted to make himself somebody who would be remembered as the poet of the people. Did Scott also fashion himself self-consciously to be remembered the way that he was, to be the great novelist of memory, or was that an accident of history?
Yeah, it's interesting to see the comparison between Scott and Burns, a bit like the Laurel and Hardy of literary history. And some people say you either choose one or the other, right? Scott is in some ways very different from Burns. He's often seen as the gentleman rather than the popular poet. He's not about singing and drinking like the Burns Commemoration is. So I think he didn't have that same sort of notion that he wanted his work to be continued. But because he wanted to write something which entertained people. And in that sense, you could see him as the first popular novelist. And because of his great popularity, you could say that's been one of the reasons why he's been succeeded by other writers. Like, there's a turnover in popular culture. So I think he would have been surprised at this incredible monument that was put up to him.
That's one of the paradoxes of popularity, right? If you are well known, you are destined to be forgotten, which is a really curious circumstance of history. One of the things that literature professors appreciate about your work, speaking of being known and forgotten, is that you point out that literature played an especially important role in transmitting memory. All through the 19th into the early decades of the 20th century, Would you say that literature still plays that role in culture, or has it been supplanted by other media, by film or by music or what have you? Is literature, does it still have a place in culture the way that it did in the 19th century?
I think we would be ostriches if we were putting our head in the sand to say that nothing has changed since the 19th century. As literature professors, we like to think that literature is the centre of the universe. It was the centre of the universe in the 19th century. I think it no longer is. I think the other media, audiovisual media, particularly Hollywood, in a sense, I said, the follow-up to Scott. At the same time, I think literature continues to be very important, particularly in generating new stories. And living and working in Europe, I'm very aware of how many of the stories that have come to us about the 20th century history and about the communist era in Eastern Europe have come to us through novels, which are then subsequently perhaps turned into movies, but it's through novels that many of these new stories are brought into circulation. So I think there's still definitely a place for literature, and it's still a driving force behind the production of stories. But it now works in this sort of, symbiotic relationship with the audiovisual.
Okay. You mentioned your own location in Europe, which I suppose is a segue for me to ask you about your involvement in this cultural memory project in Europe. What is this? Is it remembering something specific? How wide does it extend in terms of number of nations involved or universities? Can you explain what this is a bit more?
Well, this is a project funded by the European Community called In Search of Transcultural Memory in Europe. And there's 26 countries involved in it, with 2 representatives from each country. And it's an attempt to try and work out, what is the future of memory in Europe? Because since the 19th century, the cultural memory has been organised along national lines. We have the idea of national heroes, national literary canons, national stories. But what you do when you're involved in a European project, when we're trying to sort of create a new type of nation, or a new type of transnation, so what do we do with those stories which sometimes we share and sometimes divide us? Relations between Holland and Germany are painful ones in relation to 20th century history. So how do we negotiate new types of a new memory which will also provide a basis for a new type of living together? And so the European Community is encouraging this sort of academic exchange.
Is this a multi-year project that's sponsored by the European Commission, but that is being taken up by a number of universities? How many partners are part of this project?
Well, there's at least 32 universities involved in it from across.
It's very extensive.
Yes, very extensive and incredibly exciting, because you suddenly discover you're talking to somebody from Croatia, so they've just experienced or coming out of the whole breakup of Yugoslavia, and they have a completely different position in relation to discussions about Europe and the future of Europe than somebody who comes from Holland. So as I was saying, it's incredibly exciting meeting people from different parts of Europe and, as it were, negotiating the sort of different perspectives on the past, and teaching us perhaps also that we have to accept that memory is a very powerful force, but it's also something that can and perhaps sometimes should be changed.
Okay. You mentioned in the description of this project, that this commission is trying to figure out what the future of memory studies is. A nice paradox, the future of memory. Let me ask you, not about Europe, but about the field now of memory studies. What is the future of memory studies? Where do you see the field going? New directions of research, new ways of thinking about it? Where do you see the next step being for this really exciting field?
Well, I think I've already, in a sense, indicated it by talking about this sort of European framework. For me, the new future is in the notion of the transnational, and how within a world where we're living in different sort of configurations, where we talk to each other at longer distances and share different sorts of frames of reference, how do we think about memory in a non-national framework? And so how do we think about a sort of form of cosmopolitan memory, where we sort of share stories which come to us from completely different parts of the world, where we can't say that my ancestor was involved in it, and yet we can say it's still part of my world. So I think it's these sort of new forms of memory cultures which are emerging with the help of new media and the help of the migration and all this movement of peoples around the world. And that, I think, is the future of memory studies, and certainly a challenge that we have to face in the future.
Okay. It has been such a pleasure talking with you, Ann Rigney. And your book is called The Afterlives of Walter Scott, published by Oxford University Press in 2012. It's great having you at BYU. Thank you for visiting with us.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you for having me.